All right, we can go ahead.
Thank you, Jen, and welcome everyone to our virtual webinar series on the book, Our Warming Planet, Climate Change Impacts and Adaptations. Welcome to everybody. We're going around the world today with our speakers, starting first with Leonard Nurse, who is going to share the real challenges of climate change on Caribbean coasts, challenges, threats, but also the pursuit of solutions under a changing climate. And then we travel, we zoom around the world from the Caribbean to South Africa and hear from Colleen Vogel and Gina Zervogel on climate change impacts on in Africa, and also very importantly, the role of urbanization in youth. So thank you to everyone. And I see we have Leonard Nurse here. Great. So we just have a few slides of introduction, but Leonard, do you want to say something right now, or your hand is raised?
Well, just to point out that I was having some problems logging in, and it just wouldn't allow me to log in. So I went in, I believe, as an attendee.
Yes. So Jen?
Okay?
So you're a panelist now, so it's all set.
Are you hearing me okay though?
Yes, we hear you fine.
Okay, good, fine. Okay.
All good. Great. Welcome. Terrific. All right, let's go to the next slide. And we're talking about the book, Our Warming Planet. And also, it's not only a virtual book, it is a real book. The book was conceived and motivated to honor the career of Martin Parry, who's at the Center for Environmental Policy at Imperial College in London. And many of us the authors in the book worked with Martin when he was co-chair of IPCC Working Group 2 for the fourth assessment. He's been at University of Oxford, University College London, East Anglia, and way back when at University of Birmingham. I want to also do a shout out to Manishka Demel, who is taking a very well-deserved break in Costa Rica, but she's been really carrying the torch for the webinars. And so a big shout out to her, who was the other editor of the book. She is she's at Columbia University. It's actually now the Climate School, leads for us our portfolio of research projects in conservation and development. So if we go to the next slide, I want to introduce David Rind, who is editor of the overarching series of lectures in climate change, because it's a very special book that has the lectures. And David, could you tell a little bit about the book based on this slide?
Yes, so as Cynthia mentioned, this is part of a series. This is actually book number 2 as part of the series, Our Warming Planet. The first book had to do with the science of climate change in its various different dimensions, sort of almost parallel to Working Group 1 for IPCC. And this, almost parallel to Working Group 2 for IPCC, looks at climate change impacts with both mitigation and especially adaptation in mind. And as you can see from the table of contents, there's several different subsections here. First one having to do with the methods and approaches for understanding climate change impacts in various sectors. The second, detailing the particular sectors like food and agriculture, sea level rise, impact on cities. The third then goes through, as we are doing today, different regions. And our 2 talks from Leonard Nurse and Colleen Vogel and Gina Zervogel are both examples of that. And as Cynthia mentioned, we will be going around the world in this series. And finally, the last section has to do with policy and practices for dealing with climate change. And as we know from daily observation, understanding and putting things into practice, there is a potential big gulf between those two. So the last section also has a lot of pragmatic applications to it. So this is the book. The book has, as Cynthia said, it's not only a virtual book, but it's an actual physical book. The book has, in addition to about a 5-page write-up on each of these aspects, also has about 20 PowerPoint slides that are available both physically in the book and also for downloading, with the idea that they can be used in education, both for students and for the general public, so that people can actually make use of the information here to not only inform themselves, but to inform others. In that sense, it's the whole series is a very unique one. In fact, the impetus for this series was not only to honor people who have been leaders in their field, but also to make information available in areas of the world in which there really has not been a lot of educational materials available. So this book seems to me, out of all the potential books in this series, the one that's going to be most useful for the greatest majority of people, because climate change impacts is really where the rubber meets the road as far as climate change goes. Back to you, Cynthia.
Thank you. And next slide is just our agenda for today. We're doing, and we're going to soon have we have polls every day, every week, every one of the webinars to see who's in the audience, and so we can really connect. Then we'll go to our 2 speakers. After each one, we'll have live Q&A sessions that are going to be moderated by Jen Evans. And then we go to a discussion. Where next? We want to hear from from the speakers, and then any authors who are in the audience today, and then we conduct a general discussion on, and with the participants, on where next for impacts and adaptation. You know, this is where we are now, but where do we go from here, and what's the cutting edge right now? And David will be moderating that, and then we do a very quick wrap up, and that's it for the next 2 hours. So let's go to Jen and getting to know the audience.
Okay, hello everyone. So we love to know where the audience is coming from. So I just have 3 polls that I'm going to launch. So let me get started with the first one. Oops. All right, the answers are coming in. I'll give a few more seconds for everyone to respond. And usually we do see involvement from almost all the regions, so that's what we hope for. All right, so I will end it so you can see the results. And almost all the regions, although the panelists can't vote, so that also changes it a bit. All right, so let me move on.
Can you we can't see the results.
Oh, sorry. There we go. Can you see that? Okay. There are the results. And that was 62% voted. So let me do the next poll. All right, so this one, we would love to know what sector you're coming from. And yes, everyone is voting. Give it a bit longer. We also usually get at least one person from each sector for this one as well, so we'll see. We'll wait just a few more seconds. All right. So mostly in research, but we have almost all the others.
right. I just want to pop in for 1 second, which is
Sure.
because the semester here in North America, the semesters are ending. That's why I think the students are all celebrating and not coming on to webinars.
I was going to say the same thing. All right, and we have just one more, so let me launch this one. All right, so tell us a bit about your relationship with climate change. Okay, looking good. All right. So we have a wide range of people's involvement, which is great. These lectures should be good for everyone. So thank you, everyone. And feel free to include in the chat your names or institutions or your email if you would like to connect with others. Thank you.
Wonderful. All right. I think now we turn to our first speaker, Leonard Nurse. Formerly, Professor Leonard Nurse was a professor of integrated coastal management and climate change adaptation at the University of the West Indies in Barbados. He was the first director of the Coastal Zone Management Unit in Barbados, and he served as chair of the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, which has done just tremendous and great leading work on small island states and the challenges of climate change for them. As many of the authors, Leonard was a coordinating lead author of the IPCC, in his case, 3rd, 4th, and 5th assessments, and his current work focuses on assessment of risk, vulnerability, and adaptation on small islands. Leonard, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Cynthia. I'm just trying to make sure that the computer wakes up. Why has it started there? Just bear with me a minute.
Of course. Looking good.
Can you see the slides okay?
Yes, but you might
Slides,
want
but we can see your notes as well.
It has gone down to number 2. I don't know why it started like that. Okay, are we fine there now?
can you put it on presentation mode?
Yeah.
Leonard, so what you're going to do is you're going to end.
All right, let me
click the X. There we go. And then you're going to go into play from start, top left. Hopefully that works.
Okay, I can put in presentation mode here.
Oh, that works. That works too. Great. Thank you.
Is that better now?
Click one more time.
Are we there now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, well, thanks for this opportunity and congratulations to you, Cynthia. And good to be linking up with colleagues. Let me just say how wonderful it was to be invited to be part of this production, the book, the slides, and so on. And it allowed me to do a number of things. One of them was to sort of reconnect with some old colleagues from the IPCC, not chronologically, of course, but colleagues that I've worked with for a long time, having been involved in 4 assessments, as well as a number of special reports. So it was good to be able to reflect on these things and make a contribution. So here we go. I'm going to provide a little bit of background and context. Then we look at drivers, impacts on tourism specifically, because that is very important in our region. And then look at a few response strategies that the region is sort of already implementing. So basically, as we all know, the Caribbean countries are really heavily dependent on the coastal and marine assets, both the living and non-living. More than 50% of our populations live within about 1.5 kilometers of the coast. Hence, most of the region's critical infrastructure to support that population and economy is relatively close to the coast. So that consequently, the threat to infrastructure is really very great, since, as I said, most of the infrastructure is coastal. Like other parts of the world, and I'm going to focus here on the ocean because we're looking at primarily oceans. Sea surface temperatures, as elsewhere, have been increasing quite a lot in the Caribbean. Noticeably, going back to about the rate of increase has been greater, going back to about the 1940s, 1950s, and we've seen that increase. We don't have a lot of data that far back. But from about the 70s, we have reasonably good data that shows that increase. This slide is an important one, I think, because what it shows is that from the modeling as well as the actual data, the observational data, is that not only is the temperature, sea surface temperature rising, but there's also a contraction in the difference between the warmest month and the coolest month. And that's very significant for corals. Typically, prior to, let's say, the 1960s and 70s, there was a cool season between about December back to about March, and a warmer season for the rest of the year. Now we're seeing that the difference in temperatures between the warmest and coolest months over the ocean is now contracting. And that's significant for corals, which used to get a chance to have a little bit of a respite previously. Now they're not. So that's one of the drivers. Another driver, of course, is sea level rise. And as elsewhere, as well as island regions of the world, sea level rise is projected to continue to accelerate over the period right down to the 2100 and beyond. These projections were run for RCP 2.6, 4.5, and 8.5. And as you can see, we ran these at the University of the West Indies for practically every island in the CARICOM region, the Caribbean community. And the result is pretty similar, as you can see, but no surprises here because this reflects what is happening globally. Now we come on to coral reefs. There's clearly a causal link between sea surface temperatures and bleaching of coral reefs. Corals, as you know, are critical for Caribbean livelihoods and economies. We know now that there's a causal link between bleaching and sea surface temperatures, and we had some really major events which continue. The first really major event that we recorded well was in 1983. Then there was 1997 to 98, 2005, 2009 to 2010. And you only require sea surface temperatures to be about at or about 1 degree Celsius above the seasonal maximum. At present, most of the coral reef biologists tell us in our region that corals are already living at the limit of their thermal tolerance in the region. And what the bleaching does is to cause changes in the architecture of the reefs through loss of rugosity, coral cover, and so on. And this is happening throughout the region. What we do know as well is that we have no field evidence, certainly not from the Caribbean, that corals can adapt to elevated sea surface temperatures, certainly not on decadal timescales. I've seen a few publications recently suggesting there may be some capacity for corals to recover and to avoid warming temperatures. Let me just point out for the record that we have no such field evidence in the Caribbean. that they can recover on decadal time scales. And work has shown that the global mean temperature must be limited to under 1.5 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial if we are to save at least 10% of our corals by the end of the century. So that's an important point to bear in mind. Some of our other resources that you would be familiar with were seagrasses, for example, which too are under pressure, primarily from rising sea surface temperatures, UV radiation, CO2, and sea level rise, which we've noticed already. These aren't just projections. These are observations that are occurring and being reported around the region. There's community redistribution due to competition. Some species are showing lower photosynthesis rates, and some are showing altered propagule formation and lower growth rates, which are leading to changes in reproduction and species decline. Mangroves are being affected as well. The main drivers here are the high sensitivity to sea level rise, air temperature, SST, CO2, and importantly, sedimentation. In fact, some species are unable to keep pace with sea level rise, and as well as the salinity and sediment changes. So thus, we're seeing changes in species composition and phenology, primarily driven by higher temperatures. And of course, the ever-present non-climate risks, which compound the situation, risks such as land use changes, and the question of coastal squeeze, which restricts landward migration. Of course, on small islands, which have little space for setting back and relocating and building inland, the question of coastal squeeze is a really challenging one. And some of the larger islands will have far more space on the coastal area for landward migration of the mangroves, but in very tiny islands, then that is not possible. The case of ocean acidification is an important one as well. We know that CO2 concentrations in the oceans are positively correlated with higher atmospheric CO2. With higher CO2, you get higher ocean acidity and lower pH. And in fact, the IPCC has projected something between 14 to 30% decline in calcification by 2050. I don't know whether this has been updated or whether these figures change, but I believe this is still the ballpark. I don't know the extent to which this has been modified in the 6th assessment report. And some laboratory studies have shown that at about 560 parts per million CO2, some corals will actually cease to grow. We actually have no ocean calcification measurements, direct measurements for the Caribbean, but what we do have is a strong set of aragonite state measurements. And aragonite is a very good proxy. It is a form of CaCO3 in corals and other marine organisms. And the lower the aragonite state, the more difficult it is for corals to form exoskeletons. We have as observational evidence in the Caribbean that between 1988 and 2012, we've seen lower ocean pH accompanied by a sustained decrease in aragonite saturation state. This is published in the work. I participated in this work on coral reef management, which Peter Mumby from Australia led. So this is another challenge for us. And of course, the consequential impacts, damage to critical habitats like reefs, mangroves, and seagrasses for our fisheries, changes in current patterns and species migration, and in a number of countries, not so much in the southern and eastern Caribbean, but more the central and western Caribbean, the flourishing of ciguatoxins leading to a higher incidence of Ciguatera fish disease. More recently, and which is basically now ubiquitous across the Caribbean, is the recent ongoing sargassum invasion. And of course, for a long time, aquatic salinization has been occurring. Mangroves have been having to deal with higher salinity levels, and some species don't do very well once the salinity So this is this is important for economy, livelihoods, nutrition, etc. The impacts on tourism are both direct and indirect. For one, there's increased risk to critical infrastructure, such as our air and seaports, and clearly the accommodations. What we're seeing is an amplification of ocean swell and storm surge elevations, which lead to the usual suspects, such as flooding and accelerated erosion and land loss. And importantly, there's considerable damage occurring to climate-sensitive attractions, again, primarily our corals. Corals are very important not only as habitat, not only to provide sediment for building the beaches naturally, and for attenuating incident wave energy, but corals are an important resource from which considerable revenue is earned from activities like scuba diving, snorkeling, and so on in the tourist industry. So that's important. Our ports and cruise ships, our ports are, again, likewise impacted. The cruise ship pier in St. Kitts, for example, in Basse-Terre was destroyed by Hurricane George in 1998. It was rebuilt in 1999 and destroyed by Lenny in the same year. So you had two the same year. It's now being redesigned with a massive revetment at the eastern and western end to protect the bulkhead. So again, this is one of those sort of direct impacts on the tourism product. Coming back to the impact of bleaching and impacts on our corals, you should be aware that scuba diving and reef activities in the tourism sector is not a trivial exercise. It ain't trivial at all. It is a very important earner of foreign exchange. Bonaire, for example, in the Netherlands Antilles, earned $50 million US from recreational diver fees. It continues to be one of the largest sources of foreign exchange for Bonaire, as well as Curacao, Saba, Aruba, and so on. In 2007, as another example, Belize earned between $150 million and $196 million US from coral reef related recreation. In the case of Barbados, another small island, we have approximately 19,000 divers visiting the country every year. These are not the number of tourists. This is over 1 million, but we're talking about specifically those who come for diver recreation. And these generate revenues in excess of $2.91 million, with a net present value of about between $9 and $12 million US. So we can see the importance of the corals. Now, how is the region beginning to adapt and respond to these challenges? Contrary to belief in some misguided regions and in some papers that I've read, while there are many similarities in small islands, and including the Caribbean, it is not homogeneous. There's a considerable amount of heterogeneity. And in terms of managing adaptation, one therefore has to assess the risk profile of each country, of course, taking into consideration the similarities. So there's some similarities, clearly there are, relating to size, remoteness, etc. But there are a considerable number equally of differences. So we have archipelagos, we have single islands, we have high islands, islands with sediment surpluses, islands with sediment deficits. We have some atolls, as in the case of the Bahamas. We have low coral islands, we have volcanic islands. And these have to be managed differently, particularly when we're dealing with things like beach management and coastal resource and the exploitation of coastal resources. So the notion that one size fits all and that the response for adaptation in a region of small islands is simple and easy is really very misguided, and it is misleading. So One of the research gaps that we identified is the assessment of transferability of successful adaptation and resilience building measures from one country to another. We've been doing this fairly successfully in a few cases, but of course, not every measure, not every option that works well in one country will automatically work well in the other, simply because they're all small islands. Now, more recently, the countries in the region have been looking very closely at the importance of nature-based solutions, a process that, as you all know, explicitly recognizes the linkages between people, livelihoods, and their natural life support systems. In the region, nature-based systems contribute to the achievement of multiple sustainable development goals, because by using this approach in some of the adaptation measures, it helps to provide biodiversity protection, restoration of ecosystem services, livelihood support, and so on. And there's also complementarity with a number of no-regret options, which help to build resistance whether or not climate change eventuates. No-regret measures such as reduced pollution loading into coastal waters, revegetation and replanting of wetlands, coral restoration and marine protected areas. And a number of the countries are now opting not only for nature-based solutions, but for hybrid options where we're integrating gray and gray technologies as adaptation responses. Just finally, a couple of examples of adaptation measures. So the region is not just sitting on its laurels and not doing anything. This slide shows two examples of pretty successful adaptation measures. Replanting of corals from fragments which were broken from a previous hurricane, replanted in 2010. This is in Laughing Bird Key in Belize. And then you can see the third slide at the top, the third panel, growth at March 2012. So there's been quite some success in this case. The bottom panel shows a project on mangrove restoration in Guyana that is ongoing. It started in 2010, where the community decided to produce their own propagules. So they set up a nursery with some assistance from external financing. And this area, to the panel to the right, over here, you can see what growth is like 4 years after. This entire swath here, this area here was badly decimated, and it is now being restored pretty well. This is being replicated in other countries in the Caribbean and other parts of Guyana as well. You know, of course, that Guyana is a pretty extensive country. It is not an island. It is part of the South American mainland. So some other South American countries are actually doing some of the same kind of work, learning from that example. And of course, a number of the countries, because of the circumstances, there's little room to set back. And given that the fact that much of the critical coastal infrastructure is coastal, you can't actually relocate a port that easily, a seaport or an airport. There's very little space to do that. So some countries actually have to turn to hard engineering solutions like coastal protection and beach stabilization, as was done with this major project in Barbados, where the sand volumes increase by approximately 26,000 cubic meters. There's now a mean beach width of 20 meters. There's been improved public access to the coast. There's enhanced amenity value for locals and visitors. And the post-construction survey in 2010 shows that 50% of the businesses reported a 5% increase in monthly revenue at minimum. So there have been some success stories like these. We had similar examples, and this one is in Jamaica, near the Norman Manley International Airport, where there was repeated damage from the passage of storms over a number of decades. culminated in one of the worst ones in 2004. That was Hurricane Ivan, when more than 300 meters of the shoreline was eroded. There was a complete isolation of the airport and the adjacent communities. So the government of Jamaica then took a decision to raise the road by 3.2 meters above mean sea level. Formerly, it was like 0.6 to 1 meter at most. And they built this coastal revetment clearly at some cost, more than $65 million US. This is the post-construction that you can see. That has worked well, and there's not been any flood events of that magnitude at all ever since ever since construction of this. I've been thinking, this is a new slide. I've been thinking a bit for a while now about where we have been and where we are going, what has been happening. And it led me to begin to conceptualize this, and maybe we can get some reaction to it. We've gone through a whole plethora of events and thinking. We've gone from denial to indicating that we don't believe in climate change. We've had, so there've been a variety of perceptions of what the climate change threat is. Some going back to the early days have said it is unproven, it is all imagined, it is not real. We've even had some scientists indicating that climates have changed in the past, and this too will pass. It's a temporary aberration, etc. And that but the reality is that climate change is a challenge that is not going away. Some have also argued that we have more pressing issues than climate change, but all that has changed. So I use this slide to show you the evolution in the thinking in the region. We've also learned, there's also been quite a lot of learning. For example, that short-term fixes often amplify the exposure and risks and vulnerability, and can often lead to maladaptation, such as building breakwaters to reduce erosion, but causing siltation of the reefs behind them. Also causing reduced lake penetration and so on through turbidity. So it has led me to raise a couple of questions, and these are questions that in my own work and a couple of colleagues of mine, I've retired, but I'm still keeping busy. And we've been reflecting in the region on these questions here. Have we, as climate researchers and climate scientists, made a convincing, credible case? Sometimes I wonder. We have, to some extent, we've come a long way, but I think there's still some way to go. Have we failed in our public education and awareness efforts? That is still, I wouldn't say that we've been a spectacular failure, but I think there's a lot of ground that we can still cover. And most importantly, we've been asking ourselves whether we think we have achieved the shifts in policy formulation, strategies, and processes that are absolutely required to facilitate the functioning of robust institutions to mainstream climate change. That's important to us, and I think that's where the rubber hits the road. These are some critical questions, I think, that confront us. And as you reflect on them as well, I think it will be interesting to get some feedback from you and see what you think about some of these issues. The final slide now. So where do we go from here? And what can we expect? Well, it is clear to us that climate change can undermine the advances in poverty reduction and sustainable development in the Caribbean. In fact, in a recent report, a number of countries in the region, and indeed in other small island states, have indicated that climate change is beginning to derail, or has begun to derail, the advances and the achievements they've been getting towards achievement of these SDGs. So that is problematic. We know that climate change amplifies the risk to critical natural resources, to food security, human health, fresh water supply, nutrition, as well as livelihoods. The region has come around for a decade or for about 2 decades now to understand that climate change is not really merely an environmental threat, but arguably the most significant development challenge that the region actually faces. And all the governments through a CARICOM climate change adaptation strategy produced by the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, has now agreed that as their mantra, effective adaptation will require a suite of responses that combine fiscal, regulatory, and technological strategies, among others, while simultaneously being risk-averse, anticipatory, and flexible with a focus on livelihoods. And that is the underlying, these are the underlying guiding principles now being used as the basis for response in the Caribbean. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leonard. Thank you very much. That was wonderful, wonderful presentation, and I look forward to the discussion. Jen, I believe there has been at least one question in the chat for Leonard.
Great. Okay, let me just share my screen again. Oops. And I will get to the questions. Okay. All right, so let's see. In the chat, we have, oops. Sorry, it won't let me open the chat.
Oh, okay. I think I've seen the question chat here.
Okay, go for it.
There's a question about citizen science. It says, has there been any, are you or anyone you know involved with citizen science? NASA Citizen Science, the National Science Foundation, and experiment.com are great resources if you're not currently connected to citizen science. Well, to respond to that, citizen science is being pursued. It is primarily being pursued by university researchers who are becoming involved in providing guidance to NGOs. There are a number of NGOs that are now involved in citizen science. I also am aware that the University of the Virgin Islands is also pursuing programs in a few projects in citizen science as part of their EPSCoR program. So yes, it is something which is being pursued, but it is really in its infancy. And I'm thankful to Devon it is, for providing these references, because I can share them with colleagues in the region who are pursuing citizen science. There's another question from Ashley. Have there been any recent studies on the impacts of climate change on agriculture in countries like Serena, Belize, and Guyana? Well, within the 5 years, yes, there's been some work generally on the risks, the threats, and projections about yields for some specific crops like rice, some root crops like potatoes and so on, and some vegetable crops. But I'm not aware of anything more recent than about 5 years or so ago. What I would suggest is that there's CARDI, the Caribbean Research and Development Institute, that is actively involved, and you may want to check with CARDI to see what they've been up to recently in terms of climate change impacts on agriculture. The University of the West Indies, the St. Augustine campus, by the way, in Trinidad, where the Faculty of Agriculture is, that's the only campus with a Faculty of Agriculture of the 3 campuses. I believe they're also doing some work, but it would be primarily on, root crops, I suspect.
Okay, so we have another question in the Q&A from Row S. Asks, what is the most meaningful and effective action that the Caribbean islands and their citizens can do based on the fact that their contributions to climate change is small?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I think the first thing, of course, is to protect livelihoods. I think that while at the international level, there's a considerable lobby via the UNFCCC process to continue to advocate for urgent domestic reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, the Caribbean also recognizes, coincidentally, the importance of adaptation. So adaptation is a big focus in the Caribbean. There are some situations in which some adaptation options can also work well as mitigation options. So for example, the use of renewable energies, primarily solar and wind, are huge now in places like Barbados, where the governments have been giving concessions for individuals and companies to go the route of solar and wind. And in fact, some of the major power companies, some of the major electricity production companies, which were in the vanguard of rebuffing anything to do with renewable energies 15, 20 years ago, are now actually installing major solar farms and feeding that energy into their own grids. So it is a very interesting turn of events. So it is really a combination of adaptation, some mitigation, and continual lobbying and advocacy at the international level.
Thank you, Leonard. And thank you everyone for the questions, both great questions and great answers. We have another from Norman Norris asked, what is the greatest asset that the region has in combating climate change?
Well, I would say that the greatest asset it has is its people and their resilience. I think that we've come a long way in understanding the threat that climate change poses. While we can't attribute everything to climate change, I think that there's now a fairly wide understanding, a much better understanding at the level of the governments. And let me just point out that I think one of the greatest assets in this whole process is the fact that the governments saw the need for institutionalizing adaptation and response to climate change on a regional basis. So while I did point out that there are differences from island to island, and it's not a homogeneous region, there are some overall overarching conditions that apply and principles that will apply for all the countries. Hence, the governments agreed back in 2002 to establish the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, the first real major regional climate change center, which is tasked with setting out the parameters and identifying efficacious adaptation options, providing guidance on implementation, monitoring, and so on. And so the center has been going very well, and it has been doing quite a lot of overseeing work. The center is also accredited to the Green Climate Fund and is executing a number of projects under that umbrella as well. So I think that is one of the greatest assets, and it came from a recognition by the governments that, look, we just can't sit back, that we have to support this thing politically. Interestingly enough, unlike some other jurisdictions which will remain nameless, we don't have changes in policy, drastic changes from being climate change friendly to dismissing climate change. So even with changes in government, there's been smooth transitions where the policy in relation to climate change responses has not changed when governments change every 4 or 5 years. So there's that consistency in administrative and political support, which I think is a good thing. We often talk about lack of political will and political support. I think in terms of supporting the climate change adaptation process and the science process, I wouldn't myself knock Caribbean governments over the last 10, 15 years. I think that they've been providing a really, really solid support for the region.
Great, thank you, Leonard. We have time for one more question. So this one is from Alex Desherbinin. Asked, I'm curious to know if Leonard has investigated the impacts on the Caribbean islands related to displacement and migration, or knows of people who have.
No, I have not myself been involved with migration from one island to another. There have been some extreme cases, which are the obvious ones. most recently is a couple of years ago, Hurricane Dorian, when was Hurricane Dorian? Time is passing so quickly, 2017, 2018, I don't remember exactly. But after Hurricane Dorian, in Antigua and Barbuda, which is, Barbuda is a very small island, which is part of the Antigua and Barbuda state. Barbuda was completely decimated in terms of housing, most of its vegetation, livelihood, opportunities, and so on. And they actually had to migrate to the main island in Antigua. I think that some residents have returned since to settle back in their original domicile. But I'm only aware of extreme cases like that. It is something which is being looked at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of the West Indies, but I myself am not directly involved in it. It is something which I think more and more will become, it could become problematic in the future. But I would say that at this point, there's no major wave of migration from one island to another. If there is, I think the other part of migration is that, as has been happening before, because of other pressures, not climate-related pressures as much, but economic pressures and so on, improving access to education and so forth. A lot of migration has occurred in the past from the Caribbean to North America. And I think that will probably continue, and climate change could become a major push factor. But no major wave of migration, either external to the region or between islands, is occurring as far as I'm aware.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Leonard. I think, take a look in the chat. I think there's one more question that perhaps you could answer in writing about peak astronomical tides. And also, Jen, can you please post the link to where all of the lectures are recorded and posted, thanks to our NOAA CC Run research group and their YouTube channel. So if we'll post that in the chat, and I think it's also at the end of the slides.